today's mindful moment, packed with insights but designed to fit into your busy life. One deep dive at a time. Ever stand in an airport security line, kind of feel like you're being sized up, categorized,
Yeah.
reduced to just your nationality?
Yeah.
It's unsettling.
Yeah, it is.
And that's the paradox of our globalized world, isn't it?
Yeah.
Borders are fading. But at the same time, those lines between us and them, they seem to be getting bolder.
They really do.
So today we're diving into Reza Aslan's Beyond Fundamentalism, and we're going to explore how this paradox that we just talked about, how it fuels the rise of religious extremism.
It's going to be a deep dive for sure into
Right.
the forces that are shaping this really complex issue, and we're going beyond just the headlines.
Right.
They're going to uncover those anxieties and desires that drive extremism.
Yeah, and we're going to unpack how religious extremism thrives. And it's not just about scripture.
It's not.
It's about identity in our world that feels so interconnected, but also very divided.
Absolutely. And Aslan actually starts the book with a really personal anecdote
Oh, interesting.
about his own experience at Ben Gurion Airport. And it's that heightened security and scrutiny, you're talking about,
Yeah.
makes him acutely aware of being categorized, based on where he comes from, his origin.
Yeah.
And it's a powerful illustration of how, globalization, it breaks down these physical barriers, sure,
Right.
but it also intensifies that need to belong, to find our place,
In a world that feels very uncertain.
Exactly. A world that feels very uncertain.
Yeah, so I want to pose this question to our listeners.
Sure.
How has your own sense of self evolved in this globalized world? Do you feel more connected or less connected
Right.
to your nation, to your culture, to your religion?
It's interesting to think about.
And Aslan argues, and I found this very interesting, that as the traditional idea of the nation state, as that being the primary source of identity, as that weakens,
Yeah,
other forms of identity rush in to fill that void,
they do.
especially religion.
That's
And he uses the fragmentation of Yugoslavia and the partitioning of Pakistan
Oh, yeah.
as very stark examples of this dynamic playing out with really devastating consequences.
They're really powerful examples. And what's so interesting here is that this void, this yearning to belong, it can be manipulated.
Oh, wow.
And that's where this idea of religious nationalism comes in.
Okay.
And Aslan uses the term Islamism
Okay.
to describe this political ideology that is seeking to establish an Islamic state.
I see.
Now, it's really important to understand that Islamism is not a monolith.
Okay, so there's nuance here.
Huge nuance, yeah.
Yeah.
It encompasses a wide spectrum of beliefs, from groups that are advocating for democratic participation all the way to those who are promoting violent revolution.
Got it. And then within that spectrum, we have jihadism.
We do.
And Aslan is very careful to distinguish it from Islamism.
Yeah.
He highlights that jihadism functions more as a social movement than a purely religious one.
That's right.
Okay. And so it transcends national boundaries, right?
Yeah, it does.
Striving for a global ummah, this united Muslim community.
Exactly. And here's where Aslan flips the script, I think, in a really fascinating way.
I'm curious.
He argues that jihadism, in its rejection of the nation state and its embrace of a global community, is actually a product of globalization itself.
Oh, wow.
It's not some, archaic throwback,
Right.
but it's a modern response
It's a modern response.
to the anxieties and disorientation of our interconnected world.
That's a very provocative idea.
It is.
It really
Yeah,
challenges the way we usually think about extremism.
for sure.
To fully grasp this, though, I think we need to dive into the jihadist concept of a cosmic war because it's very central to their worldview.
Absolutely, because in their view, they're locked in this metaphysical battle, this battle between good and evil, a struggle that transcends earthly concerns.
Right, so it makes it almost impossible to address using traditional methods.
Right, because it's a cosmic war, so it's not bound by the traditional rules of war. Victory is measured by the strength of your faith, not by military might.
So how do you fight that, right?
Exactly.
Like, how do you fight a cosmic belief system?
Right. And Aslan actually uses these very chilling quotes from jihadist writings to illustrate this worldview.
Oh, wow.
Paints a picture of an ideology that's just so difficult to counter,
It's hard to even understand, let alone counter.
It is.
And this ideology has very deep roots, too.
It does.
Aslan traces jihadism all the way back to 20th century anti-colonial movements.
It does.
And he points to figures like Sayyid Qutb,
Yeah.
who advocated fighting the near enemy, which was, corrupt Muslim
And
rulers,
his first step.
as a stepping stone to confronting the far enemy, which is the West.
Exactly.
Qutb's writings are so incredibly influential in jihadist circles. He argued that true Islam actually demands a state governed by Sharia law,
And that anyone who didn't support that goal was an apostate.
which essentially justifies violence against anyone deemed insufficiently Islamic.
Exactly. A very dangerous idea.
Extremely dangerous. And this leads us to the evolution of groups like Al-Qaeda, transforming from, a regional force focused on toppling governments to a transnational movement with a global agenda.
Right. But here's another key insight. Al-Qaeda isn't this monolithic, centrally controlled organization.
What is then?
Think of it more as a franchise, a brand, an ideology
I see.
that inspires individuals and groups across the globe.
So to grasp the devastating impact of this ideology on the ground, I think we should go to Tuz Cormado in Iraq with Aslan.
Definitely.
He describes this place. It's a place where Sunnis, Shiites, Kurds, and Turkmen all coexisted
Wow.
peacefully until, of course, the arrival of jihadist militants.
Who saw that diversity as a threat?
Exactly. And Aslan shares this really harrowing story
Oh, no.
of a suicide bombing on Eid al-Fitr,
A joyous holiday.
a joyous Muslim holiday marking the end of Ramadan. Imagine a young man, a stranger to the town, arrives with a cart full of candy and toys.
Oh, God.
He draws a crowd of children before detonating himself. It's just a chilling example of how this ideology justifies violence. And it's not just against those they label infidels, it's against other Muslims.
But other Muslims who don't conform to their rigid interpretation of Islam.
And that's where that doctrine of al-wala wal-bara, that idea of loyalty and disavowal, really comes into play.
That's right, because this doctrine basically dictates that true Muslims can only be loyal to those who share their ideology.
They must disavow everyone else.
Exactly.
It's so extreme. They even go as far as practicing takfir, which is the act of declaring someone an infidel, removing any religious prohibitions against killing them.
It's a very dangerous idea.
Aslan brings up the Amman Conference, where over 170 leading Muslim scholars from various sects came together. They wanted to denounce this practice of takfir, the jihadist response. They declared everyone at that conference apostates deserving of death. It just highlights the immense challenge of engaging in dialogue.
With a movement so entrenched in this, cosmic battle mentality.
Yeah. And to understand how deeply rooted this mindset is, I think we need to go back in time with Aslan.
Go back in time.
Back to the 13th century, to the Mongol sack of Baghdad.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Baghdad at that time, it was flourishing, a center of learning and culture. Scholars from all over the world would gather there.
It was known as the House of Wisdom.
Then came the Mongols, and Aslan does not shy away from depicting the brutality of their conquest. The destruction was just immense. Massacres, the burning of libraries, a cultural and intellectual devastation that left a profound scar on the Muslim world.
Yeah, it must have been a very traumatic event.
In this context, we encounter Ibn Taymiyyah,
Okay.
a 13th century scholar living in a time of immense social and political upheaval. His writings would later become extremely influential for modern-day jihadists. He argued that true Islam required a return to the purity of the early Muslim community, and he saw jihad as a vital tool to defend the faith against enemies both external and internal.
So his work provided a framework for understanding the world in terms of this cosmic struggle.
Exactly. And as we see with modern jihadism, that framework can be used to justify extreme violence, all in the name of purifying the faith. Aslan then jumps to a more recent event, the 1981 assassination of Anwar Sadat.
The Egyptian president.
Yes, he delves into the jihadist rationale behind the assassination, examining the writings of Omar Abdel Rahman.
Oh, the guy later convicted for his role in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing.
That's right. Abdel Rahman argued that Sadat was an apostate because he made peace with Israel and didn't implement Sharia law. And this assassination was a turning point, I think, because it demonstrated this willingness to use violence even against Muslim leaders.
Even against Muslim leaders deemed insufficiently Islamic.
Exactly. And it ignited this debate within the broader Muslim community about using violence for political aims, a debate that continues to this day. It's this clash between those who see Islam as a religion of peace,
right,
and those who see it as a call to armed struggle.
Yeah, and it's such a complex issue with, such deep roots.
So having laid this groundwork, this historical context, we're left with a critical question, and it's this. How do you confront a movement that operates beyond traditional battlefields? A movement that believes it's engaged in a cosmic war? And that's a question that we're going to be grappling with in part two.
It's a big one. So how do you confront a movement like this, one that operates beyond traditional battlefields? A movement that believes it's engaged in this cosmic war. Aslan argues that the war on terror, as it's been framed, you can't win it through purely military means.
Yeah, it's interesting because he really pushes back against that idea that you can just, defeat Al-Qaeda as an organization. We talked about it earlier. It's more like a sprawling social movement. It's decentralized. It adapts. Aslan quotes Abu Musab al-Suri, a very prominent jihadist strategist who describes Al-Qaeda as a call, a reference, a methodology. So it's an idea, not just a group of people.
And you can't really bomb an idea out of existence, can you? It's about really understanding the grievances that fuel this movement, both local and global grievances. And Aslan emphasizes the role of globalization in this, that sense of alienation and marginalization that some young Muslims feel, particularly in the West. It can create a very fertile ground for extremist ideologies to take root. These are really complex issues that can't be solved through military force alone.
And he also talks about social media and technology's role in spreading jihadist ideology. I mean, we see this even more today than when Aslan wrote the book. It's chilling how effectively these tools can be used to spread these messages. But it also makes you wonder, could these same tools be used to counter extremism? Could we use them to kind of offer these alternative narratives, promote critical thinking, understanding?
I think that's a really important question. It's like, fighting fire with fire in a way. How do you engage in a battle of ideas when the other side is operating from a completely different framework, a framework that sees compromise as weakness and violence as like a sacred duty?
Yeah, and Aslan doesn't shy away from this complexity. He even dives into the rise of right-wing groups in Europe, using the British National Party as an example. He tells this story about anti-Muslim graffiti in Beeston, England, and how the BNP exploited the fear and anger after the 77 London bombings, to advance their own agenda. It's a reminder that Islamophobia and extremism can feed off each other, creating this vicious cycle of fear and hatred and violence.
It's scary how easily fear can be manipulated like that, and how dangerous it is when political groups just exploit that fear for their own gain.
And it's not always clear-cut either. To illustrate the factors that can lead to radicalization, Aslan uses the story of Hasib Hussain, one of the 77 bombers. Hussain was a second-generation Pakistani Briton from Beeston, and he seemed to be well integrated into British society. It was a shock to everyone when he carried out that attack.
Right, because it challenges those simple narratives about radicalization we often hear, right? It's not always about poverty or lack of education or even intense religious fervor. Sometimes it's about finding a sense of belonging, of identity, of purpose. And unfortunately, sometimes extremist ideologies can offer a very twisted version of those things.
And Aslan connects this back to his discussion of social movements. He says it's so important to understand the grievances that drive these movements, even those that employ violent tactics. And that religion, while often a force for good, it can also be used to justify violence, to sanctify it, to provide that cosmic framework for action.
And he brings up a really interesting example to illustrate this point. The liberation theology movement in Latin America, a movement within the Catholic Church that emerged in the 1960s.
So advocating for social justice, the rights of the poor and oppressed.
Exactly.
Which, at its core, liberation theology was about fighting for equality and liberation.
Yeah.
Noble goals. But Aslan explains that the movement's turn to violence was a direct response to the repression they faced from those authoritarian regimes.
They saw themselves in the struggle against evil, where violence was seen as a necessary evil to achieve a more just and equitable society. I think it's a reminder that even movements with good intentions can get entangled with violence when they're pushed to their limits.
So where do we go from here? What is the path forward? Aslan starts by dissecting the Bush administration's approach to the Middle East, specifically the Democracy Project. This idea that by promoting democracy, we could create more stability and peace in the region.
There was this initial optimism, surrounding this project, but Aslan points out that the U.S. didn't follow through on its promises, which alienated a lot of people in the Muslim world, and it ended up feeding into this narrative of a Western crusade against Islam.
And then, of course, the election of Barack Obama,
Yeah.
a really historic moment, offering this maybe glimmer of hope for a new approach. Aslan highlights Obama's efforts to reach out to the Muslim world, his personal background, son of a Muslim father, and his use of a language of mutual respect.
It was a big contrast from the Bush administration, and while Obama's approach, wasn't perfect, it definitely shifted the conversation, at least for a while.
And Aslan asks us to really consider what are the potential benefits and risks of promoting democracy in the Middle East. He acknowledges it's complex, there's potential for unintended consequences, but he also argues that we need to engage with moderate Islamist parties, groups that, may share some democratic values but also advocate for a role for Islam in public life. And he says that this is vital to counterbalancing the appeal of jihadism.
So recognizing that there are different paths to democracy, paths that are going to be shaped by local contexts, by history, Aslan uses the example of Turkey's AKP, which is a party with Islamist roots that's kind of evolved into a more moderate pro-democratic force, maybe a potential model. It's not about imposing our own vision of democracy, but supporting the emergence of democratic systems that are rooted in the local culture and values.
So what can we do as individuals to address this complex issue? How do we break down these us versus them barriers? How do we foster a more nuanced understanding of the things that are driving extremism? These are some big questions that we're going to explore in part 3. So we've been talking about some really heavy stuff, exploring the roots of jihadism, the role of globalization, the complexities of democracy promotion.
Definitely. It's a lot to unpack.
And I think, for our listeners, it might feel kind of overwhelming, right? So it begs the question, what can we do as individuals? How can we move beyond these, kind of simplistic us versus them narratives and actually contribute to building a more peaceful and just world?
And Aslan doesn't really give us these, easy answers.
Which I appreciate.
I do too, because it acknowledges how big this challenge is.
Right.
But he does say that understanding is the first step.
Makes sense.
We need to move beyond just demonizing entire groups of people.
Yeah.
And actually grapple with those complex factors that lead people towards extremism.
It's like that saying, right?
Yeah.
You can't solve a problem you don't understand.
Exactly.
So we have to be willing to ask tough questions, challenge our own assumptions, and really listen.
Really listen.
To the perspectives of those we might disagree with.
And that includes listening to moderate Muslims.
Oh, absolutely.
Because they're often caught in the crossfire.
They are.
Aslan argues that engaging with them and supporting those voices is crucial.
Yeah, I can see why.
Because they're offering that alternative to the extremist narrative.
Right.
A vision of Islam that is compatible with peace, with tolerance, with democratic values.
He uses the example of the elections in Pakistan's northwest frontier province, where moderate Islamist parties actually won a lot of support.
Right. It shows that there is that appetite for change within these communities.
Yeah.
This desire for a society that's more just and more equitable.
And that brings us to another really important point, addressing grievances.
Right, because we can't just focus on countering the ideology.
It's deeper than that.
We have to look at those underlying conditions.
The root causes.
The things that create fertile ground for extremism to take root.
Like poverty, discrimination, lack of opportunity.
Political disenfranchisement.
Yeah.
All of these things matter.
So it's not just about fighting this war of ideas.
It's about changing the reality.
It's about building a world where those ideas don't resonate as strongly.
Exactly.
Because people's basic needs and rights are being met.
And that's a long-term project.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But Aslan argues that it's the only sustainable path to lasting peace.
I think he's right.
He reminds us that building those bridges takes time and patience.
A willingness to engage with people who are different from us.
Absolutely.
It's about fostering intercultural understanding, promoting empathy.
And rejecting those fear-mongering tactics that we see all the time.
The ones that fuel division and conflict.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Reza Aslan's Beyond Fundamentalism, I don't know about you, but I'm left with this kind of renewed sense of the challenge, but also the possibility.
I am too, because it's complex for sure.
It is.
But even just understanding the forces at play.
That's huge.
It's the first step towards creating a world where religion can inspire hope, not hate.
Well said.
I think Aslan would agree.
I think so too.
He leaves us with this call to action,
I'm listening.
To engage in this struggle for understanding, challenge our own biases, and work towards a future where religion, in all its forms, can be a force for good in the world. And if you found this conversation insightful, we really encourage you to check out Reza Aslan's book, Beyond Fundamentalism. We've included a link to purchase it in the show notes. And if you're enjoying these deep dives, please subscribe to the podcast, share this episode with your friends, and join us next time for another exploration of the ideas that are shaping our world.
I'll be here.